2012, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, 7 dead. 2015, Charleston, South Carolina, 9 dead. 2018, Pittsburgh, 11 dead. 2019, El Paso, Texas, 23 dead. Also 2019, Christchurch, New Zealand, 51 dead. And now Buffalo, 10 dead. Our next guest, Professor Kathleen Belew, writes, in each event, a white power activist was the perpetrator. Several of the assailants wrote extensively about their motivations in manifestos that outlined a coherent political ideology. And in the United States, they have been backed by a broad social movement. The historical record reveals an interwoven tapestry of people on the militant right who have united in common cause to target minority communities and to undermine American democracy, and who ultimately hope to provoke race war. The other half of white nationalism is in our halls of governance and on our televisions, claiming ignorance of its most violent outgrowths. The alleged shooter in Buffalo is said to have written that boredom, isolation, and internet radicalization led him to his act. Imagine how many others like him are in front of their screens, alone but together. Joining us now is Kathleen Belew, an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I just want to give you an open mic here to start off with your reaction to what we've seen in Buffalo.
Oh, it's another one of these events, Lawrence. I mean, it's a tragedy that keeps happening and happening and happening. And although we are learning something about how these are interconnected events, about the huge danger they pose to vulnerable communities and to our society at large, we seem to really be at the end of our rope and coming up with real solutions. I think that this is a difficult one because the knot of problems has become so tangled in itself. There's the problem of the violent white power movement and militant right that are putting forward lone wolf style attackers that carry out these events. There's the problem of the same set of groups putting forward direct threats on our democracy and performative activism like the January 6th insurrection. And then there's the problem of theories and rhetoric that bridge between these fringes and our political mainstream. All of these are problems for different reasons, but together they really have created a difficult landscape for people who are trying to work to fix this problem.
You've read the document that's being called a manifesto that this Buffalo murderer had. One of the things that struck me in your reporting on that is that a vast section of it was simply lifted from the manifesto written in New Zealand.
That's right. I put it through a plagiarism software. I'm a professor, so I have one of these at hand, and huge percentages of the documents are identical or simply transposed and mixed up in order. I think that tells us a few critical things. One is that there's a shared sort of community of information sharing that connected these two people together, although not directly. These ideas and tactics are moving between gunmen. Another thing of note is how much of that document is given to the specifics of the attack. And here I'm talking about weapons selection and selection of targets, tactical readiness, protective gear. All of that means that we should be thinking of these manifestos as instruments that are meant to radicalize further shooters and propel them to action. In other words, none of these, not only are these not isolated events, but these are set up to perpetuate themselves over time.
You have that haunting phrase and that image of them in front of their screens, whether they be watching Fox or searching the internet for more poison, and that image of them alone but together. This concept of the lone wolf is not what we're looking at here.
No, and so let me explain why. This movement, the white power movement and the militant right broadly, came together in the late 1970s out of a number of populations that were upset with what they saw as threats to the status quo. In fact, the same set of ideas that would later become what we are now talking about as replacement theory, which we can get into in a moment. But these activists came together and began to use the early internet in 1983-84 to perpetuate acts of cell-style terrorism meant to look like they were disconnected to one another and disconnected to direct communication with movement leadership. Now, that strategy, leaderless resistance, was designed to make it more difficult to prosecute these gunmen in court and to make it more difficult for FBI and other surveillance agencies to infiltrate. But the bigger legacy of leaderless resistance has been this idea of the lone wolf gunman, the idea that these are single actions, that they aren't connected with one another, and that these are sort of one-off madmen perpetrating the attacks. This couldn't be farther from the truth. This is a broad-based social movement. The action is ideological and not simply sort of lunatic, unpredictable mass violence. And it all follows a pattern that is decades, if not generations old.